A town will forgive a thief before it forgives a man it believes is a coward. The dust rolled low across Red Hollow like smoke from an old war, drifting between wagon wheels and hitching posts while the noon sun baked the town in dry August heat. Men stood outside the Silver Spur Saloon with whiskey glasses in their hands and sweat darkening the collars of their shirts, talking loudly about tomorrow's military parade, about army banners and polished horses and the great commander Augustus Hale finally passing through their forgotten stretch of Arizona territory. Then the stranger rode in. No one noticed him at first, just another tired cowboy crossing through town. His horse looked older than the saddle strapped across its back, ribs faintly visible beneath dull brown hide. The rider sat silent beneath a weather-stained hat. His long coat coated in trail dust so thick it looked sewn into the fabric itself. He rode slowly, like a man carrying more years than he should. But when he stopped in front of the saloon and climbed down from the saddle, the street began to quiet. Someone recognized him. "Lord above," an old ranch hand muttered near the barber shop. "That's Elias Mercer." The name spread fast, like wind catching dry grass. Faces hardened. Conversations stopped. A younger cowboy leaned against the saloon rail and narrowed his eyes. Thought that coward was dead. Elias Mercer pretended not to hear it. He tied his horse carefully beside the water trough, running one rough hand along the animal's neck before taking off his hat and stepping toward the swinging saloon doors. The room inside smelled of whiskey, cigar smoke, and old wood soaked with years of bad decisions. Piano music stumbled somewhere in the back. Men turned in their chairs the moment Elias entered. Some stared quietly, others smirked openly. Elias walked to the counter without looking at anyone. "Coffee," he said softly. The bartender froze. Then he laughed under his breath. "We don't serve deserters here." A few men chuckled behind him. Elias stood still. Dust clung to the creases of his coat. One sleeve looked torn near the shoulder, stitched back together by hand. "I'm paying," Elias replied calmly, setting 2 worn silver coins onto the counter. Before the bartender could answer, another man stepped forward. Tall, clean boots, fresh shave, the kind of cowboy who cared more about appearances than weather. He slapped the coins off the counter and sent them spinning across the floorboards. "You got nerve showing your face here after Devil's Pass," the man said. Men died up there. Silence settled over the saloon. Heavy silence. The piano stopped. Elias slowly bent down and picked up one of the coins near his boot. His movements stayed calm, almost tired. "Maybe you should leave," the bartender muttered, "before folks remember what they lost because of you." For a moment nobody moved. Then laughter broke out near the poker tables. Mean laughter. The kind born from old bitterness handed down so many times people forgot where it started. Elias slid the coin back into his pocket and turned toward the door without another word. Outside, the heat hit him again like a furnace blast. He walked past the saloon porch and lowered himself onto a bench beside the general store. Across the street, 2 boys whispered while staring at him. One of them picked up a pebble and tossed it near Elias's boots. "Coward," the boy muttered. Elias looked at neither child. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the last piece of dried apple he had. He broke it in half and fed it to his horse before taking a single bite himself. From the edge of the street, hidden partly behind a wagon wheel, a skinny Apache boy around 12 years old watched everything in silence. His name was Tomas, and unlike the others in Red Hollow, he noticed something strange about the dirty cowboy everyone hated. Every cruel word thrown at Elias Mercer landed like a stone against old wood. But the man never once looked angry. He only looked tired, like someone who had spent 12 years carrying a story too heavy for one man alone. The afternoon heat settled over Red Hollow like a heavy blanket, pressing the smell of dust, horses, and dry wood into every corner of the street. Elias Mercer remained seated on the bench beside the general store while the town slowly moved around him. With deliberate distance, as if even standing too close might stain a man's reputation. Wagons creaked past. Spurs jingled across wooden sidewalks. Somewhere down the road, a hammer struck iron at the blacksmith shop in slow, steady rhythm. But every few minutes, someone glanced toward Elias with the same expression people used when looking at an old grave they wished had stayed buried. Tomas kept watching from the shade near the feed store. The Apache boy said nothing. He only studied the stranger carefully, noticing details the others ignored. Elias sat with his elbows resting loosely on his knees, hat lowered against the sun. His boots were cracked from years of hard miles, but polished clean despite the dust. His horse drank slowly from the trough while Elias gently brushed flies from the animal's neck with one tired hand. Most men fed themselves first. Tomas noticed that too. A pair of ranch hands walked past carrying sacks of grain. "That him?" one whispered quietly. "The scout from Devil's Pass?" The other nodded. "My uncle said he abandoned 30 soldiers in the canyon." Elias did not react. The words drifted through the heat and vanished like smoke. A few minutes later, the sheriff stepped out of his office across the street. Wade Callahan was a broad man with silver at his temples and the permanent squint of someone who spent too many years staring into desert sunlight. His badge gleamed clean against his vest as he crossed toward Elias with slow, heavy steps. Conversations nearby began to quiet again. Sheriff Callahan stopped a few feet from the bench. "You planning on staying long?" Elias looked up calmly. "Just until morning." "Morning might be too long." The sheriff rested both thumbs near his gun belt. "Not threatening, just cautious. Folks here remember Devil's Pass different than you probably do." Elias nodded once. "Most people do." That answer seemed to bother the sheriff more than anger would have. Callahan studied the older man's face, perhaps expecting excuses, or bitterness, or drunken denial. Instead, he found only exhaustion sitting behind pale gray eyes. "Commander Hale arrives tomorrow," the sheriff said quietly. "The town wants peace." During the parade, Elias gave a faint, almost humorless smile. "Then I will stay out of the way." Across the street, laughter suddenly burst from the saloon porch. The same clean-cut cowboy from earlier leaned against a post with a whiskey glass in hand. "Hear that?" he called loudly. "The coward promises to behave himself." A few men laughed with him. Tomas watched Elias carefully then. Watched for anger. Watched for shame. But Elias only lowered his eyes and removed something small from inside his coat pocket. A folded piece of paper worn soft from age. He stared at it silently for several seconds before sliding it back inside his coat again. Tomas could not see what was written there, but the cowboy's hands changed when he touched the paper. Softer somehow, like holding on to something already half gone. The sheriff noticed it too. "You still carrying that thing around?" he asked quietly. Elias looked away toward the distant hills beyond town. "Some burdens do not get lighter." Wind drifted through the street then, carrying dust in long golden trails beneath the lowering sun. Church bells echoed faintly from somewhere near the north end of town. A little girl carrying a bucket crossed the road carefully around Elias instead of near him because her mother pulled her away before she could get close. Tomas felt his jaw tighten at that. The boy understood hatred. He had seen enough of it aimed at Apache families camped outside town limits. But this felt different. Red Hollow did not look at Elias Mercer with fear alone. They looked at him like a man who reminded them of something ugly they wished to forget. As shadows stretched longer across the street, Tomas finally stepped out from beside the feed store and walked toward the bench. Elias heard the footsteps but did not look up. The boy stopped beside him and held out a small canteen wrapped in worn leather. "You look thirsty," Tomas said quietly. For the first time all day, Elias Mercer looked surprised. The canteen felt cold in Elias Mercer's hands, colder than the evening air beginning to settle across Red Hollow. He looked at the Apache boy for a long moment before unscrewing the cap and taking a slow drink. The water tasted faintly of cedar bark and mountain spring. Clean water. Hard to find this far south in August. Elias handed the canteen back carefully. "Thank you," he said. Tomas shrugged one shoulder, though his dark eyes stayed fixed on the older man's face. "Most people around here would rather watch somebody thirst." A faint smile touched the corner of Elias's mouth for barely a second. That usually says more about them than the thirsty man. Across the street, lanterns flickered alive one by one as dusk rolled over the town. Golden lights spilled through saloon windows onto the dusty road while piano music drifted outside again. Louder now, mixed with laughter and the clinking of whiskey glasses. Red Hollow looked peaceful at sunset. But Tomas had lived near enough to towns like this his whole life to know peace and kindness were not always the same thing. Elias rested both hands loosely over the top of his hat. His knuckles were rough with old scars, the kind earned from rope burns, rains, bad weather, and years of survival. Tomas noticed another scar near the man's wrist, pale and narrow beneath his sleeve cuff. Soldier scars, his uncle would have called them once. "You really left men behind?" Tomas asked quietly. Elias did not answer immediately. He stared down the street toward the distant church steeple where swallows circled through the fading orange sky. "That is what people believe," he said at last. Tomas studied him carefully. "And what do you believe?" Before Elias could answer, the saloon doors slammed open hard enough to rattle the windows. The clean-cut cowboy from earlier stepped onto the porch with 3 others beside him. Whiskey had made them louder, meaner too. "There he is," the cowboy called out, pointing toward the bench. "Red Hollow's favorite coward." Several men nearby laughed under their breath. Tomas stiffened slightly, but Elias remained still. The cowboy stepped off the porch slowly, boots grinding against dirt. "You know my father rode with the cavalry at Devil's Pass?" he said. "Spent his last winter coughing dust out of his lungs because your scared hide ran from the canyon." Elias lifted his eyes calmly. "What was your father's name?" The question caught the younger man off guard. "Franklin Doyle." Elias nodded once, very slowly. "Your father carved little horses from pine wood during night watch. Kept one in his saddlebag for his daughter." Silence fell for half a second. The cowboy's expression shifted. Just briefly, surprise breaking through anger. "How would you know that?" Elias looked away again toward the horizon. "Because I knew him." The younger man's jaw tightened immediately, as though uncertainty itself offended him. "Do not pretend you were his friend." He stepped closer now, close enough that Tomas could smell whiskey on his breath even from the bench. "Men like you do not deserve to speak their names." Tomas expected Elias to rise then, expected anger, expected shouting. Instead, Elias only reached down beside the bench and picked up a worn leather saddlebag. "You should head home," he told Tomas quietly. "This town changes after dark." The boy frowned. "What about you?" Elias stood slowly, joints stiff from long miles in the saddle. "I have slept in worse places than Red Hollow." Wind drifted through the street again, carrying the distant smell of rain somewhere far beyond the desert hills. Sheriff Callahan stepped out of his office at that moment, watching the tension from across the road with tired eyes. He opened his mouth as if considering whether to intervene, but before he could speak, a sharp metallic sound echoed from the far end of town. Bells. Railroad bells. Every head turned instinctively toward the northern tracks. Then came the whistle. Long, low, powerful enough to cut straight through the evening air. Tomas saw something change in Sheriff Callahan's face immediately. Concern. The sheriff looked toward the station and muttered under his breath. That train was not due until tomorrow. Elias Mercer slowly lifted his eyes toward the tracks too. And for the first time since entering Red Hollow, the old cowboy looked genuinely uneasy. The whistle echoed a second time across the darkening desert, deeper now, heavier somehow, rolling over Red Hollow like distant thunder before fading into the hills. People began stepping out from stores and saloons to look toward the tracks north of town. Lantern light flickered across nervous faces while the evening wind carried smoke from the arriving locomotive through the streets. Sheriff Callahan adjusted his hat and stared toward the station with growing unease. That train should not be here until noon tomorrow, he muttered again. Elias Mercer remained standing beside the bench, his weathered eyes fixed on the tracks beyond the buildings. Tomas noticed something strange then. The old cowboy's hand had tightened around the leather saddlebag at his side hard enough to pale his knuckles beneath the dust. Not fear exactly, Recognition. Like a man hearing footsteps he prayed would never find him again. "You know who is on that train," Tomas said quietly. Elias took several seconds to answer. "I know who could be." The clean-cut cowboy laughed from behind them, though the sound carried less confidence than before. "Maybe the army finally came to drag you back for desertion." His friends chuckled weakly beside him, but most of the town was already moving toward the station now, drawn by curiosity stronger than gossip. Red Hollow did not receive unexpected visitors often, especially not military trains after sundown. The sheriff crossed the street slowly. "Everybody stay calm," he called out, though nobody had panicked yet. Elias glanced once toward Tomas. "Go home to your family." Tomas shook his head immediately. "I want to see what happens." Elias studied the boy's stubborn expression for a moment. Then, surprisingly, he nodded once. "Stay behind me if trouble starts." Together they walked toward the station with the rest of the town flowing ahead like a river of boots and lanterns. The depot stood near the edge of Red Hollow where the desert flattened into open darkness. Steam hissed from the black locomotive as it sat motionless on the tracks, iron sides glowing faintly beneath hanging lanterns. Soldiers stood beside the train cars in dark blue uniforms with rifles slung neatly across their backs. Not many, maybe 12 in total, but their silence changed the atmosphere immediately. Soldiers who expected trouble talked loudly. Soldiers prepared for trouble stayed quiet. Tomas felt it too. The crowd slowed as they approached the platform. Sheriff Callahan stepped forward first. "I am Sheriff Wade Callahan," he announced carefully. "What brings the army into Red Hollow tonight?" One of the soldiers glanced toward the rear passenger car before answering. "Special orders from Fort Lincoln." That was all he said. No explanation, no smile, just procedure. The station suddenly felt smaller somehow, tighter. The clean-cut cowboy whispered near the back of the crowd. "Commander Hale is supposed to arrive tomorrow morning for the parade." Another man frowned. Maybe plans changed. Then the rear car door opened. Every conversation stopped at once. A tall officer stepped down slowly into the lantern light, boots polished black beneath a dark cavalry coat lined with brass buttons that caught the glow like gold. Gray streaked the man's beard near his jaw, but his posture stayed straight as an oak post driven deep into hard ground. Commander Augustus Hale. Tomas had never seen him before, but he recognized authority the moment it stepped off that train. The commander scanned the crowd carefully, saying nothing. Men removed hats instinctively. Even the loudest drunks near the saloon now stood silent beneath the weight of that stare. Sheriff Callahan stepped forward again. "Commander Hale, sir, we were not expecting you until tomorrow." Hale gave a short nod without taking his eyes off the crowd. Circumstances changed. His voice sounded calm, tired too, like someone carrying miles of unfinished history. Then his gaze stopped completely. Tomas felt the shift beside him before understanding it. Elias Mercer had frozen. Across the platform, under the glow of railroad lanterns and drifting steam, Commander Augustus Hale stared directly at the dusty cowboy standing near the back of the crowd. The commander's expression did not harden with anger the way everyone expected. It changed into something far stranger. Shock. Real shock. One of the younger soldiers noticed it immediately and looked between the two men in confusion. The clean-cut cowboy smirked under his breath. "Well," he whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "Looks like the commander finally found his coward." But Commander Hale did not move toward Elias with fury in his eyes. Instead, beneath the hiss of steam and the low desert wind, the old officer took one slow step forward like a man staring at a ghost he never expected to see alive again. Steam drifted through the station in long white clouds while every soul in Red Hollow stood frozen beneath the lantern glow. Commander Augustus Hale kept his eyes locked on Elias Mercer as though the rest of the town had vanished completely. The old cavalry officer took another slow step forward across the wooden platform, boots striking the boards with quiet authority. Nobody spoke. Even the train itself seemed quieter now, its iron engine hissing softly in the desert night like some giant creature waiting to see what happened next. Tomas stood close beside Elias and felt the tension running through the crowd like a wire pulled too tight. The clean-cut cowboy folded his arms with a smug grin. "Well," he muttered to the men beside him, "this ought to be good." Elias remained still beneath the hanging lanterns. Dust covered his coat collar and silver streaked the edges of his beard now under the stronger light. He looked older than before, more tired somehow. But Tomas noticed something else too. Elias was standing straighter than he had all evening. Not proud, not defensive, just ready. Commander Hale stopped only a few feet away. The soldiers near the train watched silently, confusion flickering across younger faces who clearly did not understand why their commander looked shaken by the sight of one dusty cowboy in a forgotten town. Sheriff Callahan removed his hat slowly, uncertain what kind of storm he was standing inside. "Elias," Commander Hale said at last. The voice carried low and rough through the station. Not the voice of a commander addressing a criminal. The voice of a man reopening an old wound. Elias tipped his hat slightly. "Commander." The clean-cut cowboy laughed once under his breath. "Funny hearing traitors talk polite." Commander Hale's eyes shifted instantly toward the sound. The younger man's smile weakened beneath that stare. "Who said that?" Hale asked. Quietly. Nobody answered. The commander turned back toward Elias again, studying the older cowboy carefully from boots to hat brim, almost as though confirming he was truly alive. "They told me you died in the canyon," Hale said. Elias looked toward the dark desert beyond the tracks. "Almost did." Silence settled again. Wind pushed dust along the rails in soft swirling lines while somewhere far off a coyote cried into the night. Tomas glanced around the crowd and saw confusion spreading now instead of certainty. This was not the meeting they expected. Not even close. The clean-cut cowboy finally stepped forward, unable to hold his tongue any longer. "Sir," he said loudly toward Hale, "this man abandoned soldiers at Devil's Pass. Everybody here knows it." Several heads nodded uncertainly behind him. The commander slowly turned his face toward the younger cowboy. "What is your name, son?" "Luke Doyle." Hale's eyes narrowed slightly. "Franklin Doyle's boy." Luke straightened proudly. "Yes, sir." For a moment something heavy crossed the commander's face. Sadness, maybe. "Your father was a brave man," Hale said quietly. "One of the bravest I ever knew." Luke nodded quickly. "And he died because of him." He pointed directly at Elias Mercer. Tomas saw hands tighten around hats nearby. The entire town seemed to lean forward, waiting for the answer. Elias said nothing. His face stayed calm beneath the lantern light. Commander Hale looked at him for several long seconds before speaking again. "No," the commander said softly. "Your father lived because of him." The words hit the station harder than a gunshot ever could. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Luke Doyle blinked in confusion. Sheriff Callahan stared openly now. Even the soldiers near the train exchanged startled glances with one another. Tomas felt his pulse quicken beside Elias. The commander stepped closer then, close enough now that only a few feet separated the two old men. Hale's eyes glistened faintly beneath the station lights. "For 12 years, he said quietly, "I searched half this territory trying to find you." Elias lowered his gaze briefly. "You should not have bothered." Commander Hale ignored the answer. Slowly, deliberately, the old officer reached up and removed his cavalry gloves one finger at a time. Every soldier on the platform noticed immediately. Tomas did not understand military customs, but judging from the sudden expressions around him, something important was happening. Then Commander Augustus Hale drew himself upright beneath the lantern glow, shoulders squared against the desert wind, and raised his hand sharply to his brow in a full military salute directed straight at the dusty cowboy the town had mocked all day long. The station fell completely silent beneath the hanging lanterns. Even the locomotive seemed to hush itself, steam curling softly into the cool desert night while Commander Augustus Hale held his salute without hesitation. Every soldier near the train straightened instantly at the sight. Tomas had never seen grown men freeze the way the people of Red Hollow froze then. Luke Doyle stood motionless with his mouth half open, confusion slowly draining the confidence from his face. Sheriff Callahan removed his hat completely now, clutching it against his chest as if suddenly ashamed to wear the badge pinned beside it. But Elias Mercer did not return the salute right away. The old cowboy simply stared at the commander with tired gray eyes that looked older than the mountains beyond town. Wind brushed dust across the platform between them while somewhere down the tracks loose metal clanged softly against iron wheels. Finally Elias lifted one worn hand toward the brim of his hat. Not a soldier's salute. Just a quiet gesture from a man who no longer believed he belonged among uniforms. Commander Hale slowly lowered his arm. His voice came rough when he spoke again. "You should have come back." Elias gave the faintest shake of his head. There was nothing to come back to. Tomas watched the commander's face tighten at those words. Not anger, regret. Deep enough to hollow out a man over time. Hale looked toward the crowd surrounding the station. These people believe Elias Mercer abandoned soldiers at Devil's Pass. No one answered him. The commander nodded once, almost bitterly. "That is because I allowed the lie to live too long." Murmurs spread quietly through the crowd now. Luke Doyle frowned hard. "Sir, everybody knows what happened there." Hale turned toward him slowly. "No, son. Everybody knows the story they were told afterward." The commander stepped away from the train platform and onto the dirt beside Elias, boots crunching softly against gravel. 12 years ago, he said, 3 cavalry units crossed Devil's Pass during the hottest August this territory had seen in decades. Water barrels split. Horses collapsed. Men could barely breathe through the dust storms tearing through the canyon. Tomas could almost see it in his mind as the old officer spoke. Endless red cliffs. Burning wind. Soldiers stumbling beneath a white desert sun. Hale continued quietly. "We were trapped in that canyon for 2 days without enough water to survive the third." Several older men in the crowd exchanged uneasy looks. Some of them remembered hearing rumors from those years. Hale glanced once toward Elias before continuing. Elias Mercer was not cavalry. He was a civilian scout hired because nobody knew those canyon trails better. Elias lowered his eyes toward the dirt. The commander's voice softened. On the second night, riders were spotted near the western ridge. Not Apache families. Renegades. Armed men waiting for weakness. Tomas noticed Elias tense slightly at the word renegades. Hale continued. Panic spread through camp. Young soldiers. Exhausted horses. Half the men already too weak to stand properly. The commander paused briefly, breathing slowly beneath the lantern light. Elias volunteered to ride through Black Ridge Pass alone and draw attention away from the canyon long enough for the rest of us to escape north. Shock rippled through the crowd. Luke Doyle blinked rapidly. "That is not possible," he whispered. Hale looked directly at him. Neither was surviving it. Wind swept harder through the station then, rattling signs and lantern chains overhead. Tomas looked up at Elias again and noticed the old cowboy standing perfectly still beside the tracks, like a man listening to ghosts speak his name after years of silence. "Your father tried to ride with him," Hale told Luke quietly. Elias refused. Said one family losing a son was enough. Luke's face drained pale beneath the lantern glow. The commander's eyes grew distant as memory settled over him like smoke. "We escaped Devil's Pass because Elias Mercer stayed behind." Silence crushed the station again. Not hostile silence anymore. Something heavier. The kind born when people realized they judged a man before knowing the shape of his scars. Then Hale reached slowly inside his cavalry coat and removed a small weathered object wrapped carefully in cloth. Tomas saw silver glint beneath the lantern light as the commander unfolded the fabric. An old cavalry badge, burned dark around the edges. Hale held it out toward Elias with trembling fingers. "I carried this for 12 years, he said softly, waiting for the chance to return it to the man who earned it. The old cavalry badge rested in Commander Hale's outstretched hand, silver catching the lantern light in soft flickers beneath the drifting steam from the locomotive. Nobody in Red Hollow spoke. Men who had spent years repeating stories about Elias Mercer now stood frozen beside the tracks, staring at the dusty cowboy like they had never truly seen him before. Elias looked down at the badge for a long moment without reaching for it. Tomas watched the old man's face carefully and noticed something unexpected there. Pain. Not fresh pain. The kind worn smooth by time until it settled deep into a man's bones. "I told you to throw that thing away," Elias said quietly. Commander Hale almost smiled, though sadness sat heavy behind it. "And I told you some debts outlive wars." Wind swept through the station again, carrying the dry scent of sagebrush and coal smoke into the crowd. Somewhere near the rear train car, a horse stamped nervously against the wooden loading ramp. Luke Doyle stepped forward slowly, his voice unsteady now. "If he saved everybody," he asked, "then why did nobody know?" Hale lowered the badge slightly but kept his eyes on Elias. "Because when we reached Fort Lincoln, Elias Mercer never came back with us." The commander paused, choosing his words carefully. "The officers assumed he died somewhere in Black Ridge Canyon. Reports were rushed. Witnesses confused. Some men swore they saw him riding south while the rest of us escaped north." Sheriff Callahan frowned. "So the army called him a deserter?" Hale nodded once. "And I allowed it." Silence deepened across the station. Tomas looked toward Elias again, but the old cowboy remained motionless beside the tracks, eyes lowered beneath the brim of his weathered hat. "Why?" Tomas asked quietly before anyone else could speak. Commander Hale finally turned toward the Apache boy. "Because by the time I learned the truth, too many important men needed the official story to stay clean." Bitterness roughened his voice now. A cavalry unit losing control in Devil's Pass looked bad enough. Admitting one civilian scout saved 3 companies after officers failed their own men would have ruined careers. Murmurs spread angrily through the crowd. Luke Doyle stared at Elias with growing disbelief. "But you survived," he said softly. "What happened?" Elias finally lifted his eyes toward the dark horizon beyond the station. For several seconds he said nothing at all. Then quietly he answered, "A family found me near the Canyon River 3 days later." Tomas noticed some men stiffen immediately at the word family, expecting soldiers or settlers. Elias continued calmly, "Apache." Another silence followed. Different this time. Uncomfortable. The old cowboy rested one hand against the saddlebag at his side, as though touching an old memory hidden inside. "They could have left me there," he said. "Most would have." Tomas felt something tighten in his chest hearing that. Elias glanced briefly toward the boy before continuing. "Instead they carried me nearly 20 miles through canyon country to a winter camp hidden near the cliffs." Commander Hale lowered his head slightly. "I searched for you for almost a year." Elias gave a tired shrug. "You would not have found me. They kept me alive through that winter. Fed me before they fed themselves some nights." Wind rattled the station lanterns overhead while nobody in Red Hollow dared interrupt him now. "When spring came," Elias said quietly, "I learned the army had already named me a coward, and the people who saved my life were being hunted by the same newspapers calling them savages." Tomas saw several townspeople lower their eyes at that word. Elias's voice stayed calm, almost gentle. "So I stayed gone." Commander Hale looked toward the crowd then, anger flickering beneath his age for the first time that night. "For 12 years this man carried disgrace that belonged to others." The words struck hard in the stillness. Luke Doyle's face had gone pale beneath the lantern glow. Slowly, uncertainly, he looked toward Elias Mercer. "My father?" he asked softly. "Did he know?" Elias nodded once. "Your father knew before he died." Luke swallowed hard. "And he never hated you?" Elias stared toward the rails for a long moment before answering. "No," his voice turned quieter then. "He hated that good men stayed silent because lies felt easier." The station fell still again after that. No laughter now. No whispers. Only the sound of desert wind moving through Red Hollow while people stood beneath the lanterns realizing the dirtiest man in town had spent 12 years carrying the honor they were too blind to recognize. No one moved for several long seconds after Elias Mercer finished speaking. The desert wind drifted quietly through the station, carrying the smell of coal smoke and dry cedar across the platform while Red Hollow stood face to face with its own shame. Men who had mocked the old cowboy outside the saloon now avoided looking directly at him. Even the loudest voices in town had gone silent beneath the weight of the truth. Commander Augustus Hale slowly folded the weathered cloth back around the cavalry badge and stepped closer to Elias again. "The army owes you more than a salute," he said quietly. "There are officers in Washington who would restore your record tonight if I asked it." Elias gave a tired smile that barely touched his face. Records never buried a man as deep as people do. Hale looked like he wanted to argue, but the old cowboy lifted one hand gently before he could speak further. "Leave it buried." Tomas stared at Elias in confusion. After 12 years of carrying another man's disgrace, after an entire town treated him like dirt beneath their boots, the old scout still spoke without bitterness. Tomas did not understand how a man survived that kind of loneliness without hardening into something cruel himself. Luke Doyle stepped forward uncertainly through the crowd then. Gone was the swagger from earlier outside the saloon. Gone was the whiskey confidence and loud laughter. He looked younger now somehow, smaller. "Mr. Mercer," he said quietly, voice tight in his throat. "I did not know." Elias looked at him calmly. "No," he replied softly. "You only knew what people handed you." Luke swallowed hard. "I should not have spoken to you that way." The old cowboy studied him for a moment beneath the station lanterns. "Your father was a good man," Elias said. "Do not waste your years carrying anger that belonged to somebody else." The words struck Luke harder than humiliation ever could. Tomas saw the younger man lower his head slowly, ashamed in a way no public punishment could have forced him to feel. Nearby, Sheriff Callahan cleared his throat roughly and stepped forward as well. "Elias," he said, removing his hat again, "I owe you an apology too." Elias glanced toward him with faint amusement. "That makes half the town tonight." A few nervous chuckles broke softly through the crowd. Small sounds, careful sounds, like people unsure they still deserved the right to laugh around him. Commander Hale looked over the gathered townsfolk then, his weathered face hard beneath the lantern glow. "There is something else you all should know," he said. Silence returned immediately. The commander gestured toward Elias. "This man spent the last decade protecting Apache families along the southern trade routes from renegades and raiders who preyed on both settlers and tribes alike." Tomas blinked in surprise. Hale continued, "Half the safe crossings through Black Ridge exist because Elias Mercer kept them open." Murmurs spread again through the crowd. Different this time. Respect replacing suspicion inch by inch. Sheriff Callahan frowned thoughtfully. "That was you." Elias shrugged once. "Seemed wrong letting innocent folks suffer because powerful men needed enemies." Tomas felt something warm settle in his chest hearing that. The boy had spent most of his life watching settlers speak about Apache families as though they were less human than everyone else. Yet the man standing beside him had been saved by Apache strangers and repaid the debt quietly for years without asking anybody for recognition. Commander Hale looked toward the soldiers near the train. "Prepare quarters in town," he ordered. "We stay the night." The soldiers nodded immediately and began unloading gear from the train cars. But before anyone could move far, Elias spoke again. "One condition." Hale turned back toward him. "Name it." Elias glanced toward Tomas briefly, then toward the dark hills beyond Red Hollow where Apache camps rested outside town boundaries because they were never welcome inside. "The Apache families camped south of the creek," Elias said quietly. "I want your word no soldier under your command troubles them while you are here." The commander answered without hesitation. "You have it." Elias nodded once, satisfied. Tomas looked up at the old cowboy then with something close to awe. After everything taken from him, the first thing Elias Mercer asked for was not honor, not money, not revenge. Only safety for people most of Red Hollow barely considered worth noticing. Wind moved softly through the station while lantern light flickered across tired faces. And for the first time that night Tomas understood why some men carried authority without ever needing a badge, a uniform, or a gun. Morning arrived slowly over Red Hollow. Pale sunlight spilled across rooftops and hitching posts while the desert air still carried traces of cool night wind drifting down from the distant cliffs. The town looked quieter than it had the day before. Softer somehow. Like shame itself had settled over the streets during the night and dulled every sharp edge people once carried so easily. Outside the Silver Spur Saloon, men swept dust from the boardwalks without much talking. Horses drank from troughs beneath the rising sun. Somewhere near the church, bells rang low and steady across the valley. Elias Mercer stood beside his horse near the edge of town, tightening an old saddle strap with calm, practiced hands. His coat still looked worn. His boots still carried trail dust from 100 forgotten roads. Nothing about him had changed, yet everything around him had. Tomas approached quietly from behind, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Miss Clara from the bakery asked me to bring this," the boy said. Elias glanced inside the cloth and found fresh bread still warm from the oven. For a moment he looked genuinely surprised. "Yesterday she crossed the street to avoid me," he said softly. Tomas shrugged with a faint smile. People walk different after truth catches them. Elias let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like laughter. Almost. Across the street, Sheriff Callahan stepped out from his office holding something under one arm. The sheriff walked slower than usual, hat low against the morning light. When he reached Elias, he held out a freshly polished deputy badge. "Town council voted at sunrise," he said carefully. "Red Hollow could use a man who knows the difference between fear and justice." Elias looked at the badge for several seconds before gently pushing the sheriff's hand back. "I appreciate it," he said, "but towns are not meant for men like me." The sheriff frowned slightly. "Seems to me towns are exactly meant for men like you." Elias only smiled faintly and returned to adjusting the saddle strap. Nearby, Luke Doyle emerged from the saloon carrying a small wooden carving in his hands. A horse carved from pine wood. Tomas recognized the way Luke held it carefully, almost reverently. "My father made this," Luke said quietly as he approached. "Commander Hale gave it back to me last night." Elias stared at the carving beneath the morning sun. His tired eyes softened in a way Tomas had never seen before. Luke swallowed hard. "I spent years hating you because it felt easier than asking questions." Elias nodded once. "Most folks do." Luke looked down briefly before offering the carving toward him. "My father wrote something inside the saddlebag before he died." Elias's expression shifted slightly. "You found the letter?" Luke nodded. "He said if he ever made it home, he wanted his son to grow into the kind of man Elias Mercer was." Silence followed those words. Not painful silence. The kind that settles when truth finally reaches the surface after too many years buried beneath pride. Elias slowly closed Luke's fingers back around the carving. "Then keep it," he said softly. "Your father earned that memory." Farther down the street, soldiers prepared horses near the station while Commander Hale stood beside the locomotive speaking quietly with Tomas's uncle and several Apache elders from the southern camp. No rifles raised. No suspicion in their eyes. Just conversation beneath the desert sky. Tomas noticed Elias watching that scene carefully. "You did that," the boy said. Elias shook his head. No, his gaze stayed fixed on the soldiers and Apache families speaking together near the tracks. People did that themselves once they stopped listening to fear. Wind moved gently across Red Hollow then, carrying dust in long golden ribbons beneath the rising Arizona sun. Elias pulled himself into the saddle slowly, years of hard riding visible in every movement now. Tomas stepped closer. "Where will you go?" Elias looked toward the western horizon where endless desert waited beyond the hills. "Wherever folks still need trails opened." Tomas hesitated before asking one last question. "Will you ever come back?" Elias considered that quietly. Then he tipped his hat toward the boy. "Maybe when this town forgets how to judge a man before hearing his story." He touched the horse lightly with his heel and began riding toward the western road. No parade followed him. No cheering crowds. Only silence. Honest silence. The people of Red Hollow stood along the boardwalks and dusty streets, watching the old cowboy disappear slowly into the morning light while the sound of distant hoofbeats faded into the desert wind. And long after Elias Mercer vanished beyond the hills, Nobody in town laughed at dirty cowboys anymore.